Thank you very much. I feel like I'm in Gauteng. Of course, I'm a newbie in Cape Town. This is my 51st day in Cape Town. Moved from Gauteng, still getting used to it. But of course, in Gauteng, if I were to speak in an audience like this, there'll be some vet students in the audience, and they'll be making some noise. So I'm sure there's UCTers in the audience. Thank you so much for the welcome. I'm an academic, and so I've prepared an academic talk. And I want to reflect on the new activism, what I call the new activism on our campuses today. And I've called it the triple helix of new activism on university campuses. Unfortunately, we won't have time to talk after this. I suspect that what I'm going to say is going to be provocative, and you might want to talk back. So I invite you to engage me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Just look for @FabAcademic and post your questions. I will rush out back to work after this, but we can talk on social media if you have questions for me. As I said, I want to talk about the new activism that has exploded on our university campuses. This explosion is mainly because of student exclusions, which have reached unacceptable proportions, and they are not always based on justice and fairness. More than 30% of students leave higher education each year because of financial or academic exclusion. Access and success in South African higher education is obviously inextricably linked to privilege. This new activism, in my view, tackles head-on the deficits that characterize the coloniality of our universities, and it is exemplified by the must-fall protests. It is true that we didn't see them coming, those of us particularly who work at universities. But in hindsight, higher education was out of touch with students and with broader civil society, especially the poor. We had our heads in metrics and compliance, bogged down by policy, audits, performance, and corporatism. This is, of course, an easy generalization, but university management has been in the thrall of neoliberal ideas, both in terms of how we run our institutions and what we teach in our lecture rooms. It is not surprising, therefore, that we now have to contend with the roads must fall in the intellectual and symbolic space. Fees must fall in the material and admission space, and outsourcing must fall in the employment space. This is what I call the triple helix of new activism. It is fundamentally about inequality and a contest for ownership of knowledge and the economy. The political formations on campuses have focused our attention on these serious threats to democracy. The methods have been rough and ready, involving vandalism, but the intractable issues still have to be faced. It seems to me, therefore, that new activism's power rests on how it has harnessed populism, political tactics, and intellectual exclusion to marshal the effective challenge to the marketized university that has lost itself in international rankings, fundraising, publication inflation, and an untransformed faculty and curriculum. In many ways, while we as South African universities previously argued that our research is relevant and the education that we offer is Africa-focused, we had our eye on the outside world more than we did on our context. Get me right. It is not wrong to focus on getting a higher rating. What is a problem is to ignore the local context. So populism has drawn on the relative strengths of students and labor movements to take the lead in changing higher education. And sometimes it has adopted a slash and burn approach, and in other times it is a carefully calculated pact based on mutual identification. It has taken on the mantle of guardian of the poor and marginalized to challenge the heartlessness of government and capital. In this sense, it is consistent with student movements across time and continents, especially at moments of political and economic flux. Another feature of this new activism is political expediency and opportunism, which has fragmented the student movement that began in solidarity at the end of 2015 with the Fees Must Fall march to the union buildings, which many of us supported and some of us joined. I was there at the march and supported the cause. But rivalries have crept in and grandstanding has led to violence and arson. It is also apparent that labor has paid dearly as outsourced workers in some universities have lost their jobs as universities consider ways of stretching their already overextended budgets. The calls for free education are also not handled adequately. Of course, no education can be free, but what is at the heart of this debate, in my view, is an ideological debate about the decommodification of higher education, rather than just affordability. And somehow, many people do not want to talk about this ideological debate. All they want to do is to focus on making higher education accessible by making it affordable through sourcing funding for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And that's admirable. But the truth is that if we do not address the challenge of decommodifying higher education, we will always have the protests happening in this way. We've got to get into the debate and decide where we stand as a country. And while this approach of focusing on accessibility and making education affordable may seem reasonable, it comes across as the generosity of the oppressor, as students would interpret it, student protesters would interpret it. The generosity of the oppressor who is only interested in protecting his own position of power. So the reason why the Access Must Rise movement that started at VETS earlier this year has not gained traction is because it is detracting attention from the real debate of decommodification of higher education. The new activism is profoundly about political change. It is part of a larger challenge to the ruling elite, confronting constitutional agnosticism, corruption, and privilege, all of which confront inequality. But the political is clearly about rethinking institutions and questioning their lack of transformation. Unfortunately, democracy has not changed the apparatus of the state, nor has it rethought the idea of the university. While 1994 provided a political solution to end apartheid, it did not reconstruct society in profound economic and structural ways. So the contestation around neoliberal economic policies and the National Development Plan is growing, and champions of economic liberation are not only flexing their revolutionary muscles in political formations, there is also a swelling tide of civil unrest. Student formations on campuses have channeled their social forces to become political game changers in democratizing democracy. And we've seen some of the results of that in the elections that have just gone past. New activism has torn at the colonial edifice of the university, whose globalizing discourses have thinly camouflaged their northern ramparts. Debates about decolonizing higher education have rapidly assembled scholarly ammunition to mount the attack on epistemic fortresses that epitomize the 19th and the 20th century university curricula. Students are attacking the conventional colonial canons of knowledge, but by marshalling African philosophy, indigenous knowledges, and research methodologies of the global south as an arsenal to disrupt chauvinist traditions of research and innovation and narrow, exclusive curricula. The untransformed academy has also galvanized marginalized black academics who describe the university in South Africa as a European greenhouse under African skies. The university has not responded spontaneously to the vast opening up of knowledges that has followed the end of the Cold War. And in McNullo's words, the colonial matrix of power is still very much in control. Of course, I am aware of the flaws in decolonial thinking that plays down complexity and sometimes even falling into the ideological trap of substituting Eurocentrism with Afrocentrism. But in the conflicted environment of inequality on most campuses, students and academic staff naturally take up hard positions. We should not shy away from the contest. We should acknowledge that Rhodes Must Fall and its progeny represent a black intellectual rage against the ideological superstructure of South African higher education and its whiteness. The inclusiveness that is preached in democratic discourse glosses the entrenched inequality of the professoriate and the intellectual apartheid that denies humanity, maintains hierarchies of knowledge, and authorizes influential scholarship. Students are summoning the wisdom of continental theorists and diasporan thinkers to engage academics in an epistemic battle. Populism and political tactics are strategically linked to a serious intellectual project to rethink the idea of the university, perhaps towards a multiversity which enlarges reservoirs of knowledge, enhances epistemic competition, fosters diversity as inclusiveness, not simply tolerance, and advocates anti-racism so that the academic project can flourish. I know that some of us may be angry, irritated, or even uncomfortable about this new activism on our campuses, but the fact that South African academics and university executives are today, in 2016, forced to debate what a transformed higher education institution should look like shows the influence of this new activism. And of course, the question is why is it that 22 years after the dawn of our democracy, we are still dealing with the debate of transformation as if we've never started? The problem is that we haven't made any progress in 22 years. I mean, you wouldn't even think about this, but in 22 years, we still have universities where you have only one black South African woman full professor in the whole university. That just tells you why there's so much anger. And so my view is that transformation, whilst we've talked about it in this country for the past 22 years, until the mass fall movement, transformation has been dealt with as a matter of compliance rather than as a matter of change in structures, ways of doing, ways of knowing, and ways of being. Transformation, in my view, it is not just about the transfer of power from one elite to another. It shouldn't just be about increasing the number of black people in seats. Our experience shows that if we only focus on the transfer of power, then the people will continue to feel powerless, marginalized, and disillusioned, as it is happening now. So while changing the social composition of power is important, we have to realize that it is not sufficient. We also need to transform the structures as well as ways of doing, knowing, and being. How universities respond to the ongoing challenges of transformation is likely to determine their relevance and importance in changing the economic and labor prospects of our country. A notable aspect of this new activism, and this is an important sort of sidetrack, but important in the talk. The notable aspect of this new activism has been its Twitter dimension. It is a social movement mobilized via social media to become what Tanya Bosch has described as a collective project of resistance to normative memory production, creating a new landscape of minority memory and bringing to the fore the memory of groups who have been rendered invisible in the landscape, thus speaking to the alternative interpretation of historical events. Tanya Bosch argues that the Twitter activism has lubricated its counter-memory. The Twitter activism that lubricated this counter-memory shows the politics and practices involved in listening across difference, or what you can call a political listening, which can undo the oppression that happens partly through not hearing certain expressions from certain kinds of people. So suddenly, the poor and marginalized are getting heard through social media because they put their thinking out there in the public for everyone not to avoid, but to engage with. What then does this new activism mean for us today? First, it helps us to understand and make sense of the deep anger in our society. And this deep anger is not only located in universities, it's all over our country. And rather than being irritated by the anger, it's important to understand it. And this new activism helps us to understand it. Even though it's violently expressed in the burning of buildings and destruction of anachronistic symbols, it helps us understand this anger and confront and deal with the anger. But secondly, it explains the vandalism that has accompanied its more thoughtful interventions. There is no denying that in the current economic system, the poor have figured out that they have very little to lose. So while vandalism is unacceptable, and in the end, it will affect the poor more harshly. And I always say it's like drinking poison and hoping your enemy dies. Even though that's the case, rather than just condemning it, we need to understand why it is happening. And then our engagement should start from the point of understanding. And not just, if you start by condemning, then nobody's going to listen to you. You want to change, you understand first, you accept, you know, this is what it is, this is where it comes from, you understand, you engage from the point of understanding. Then you'll be heard by the other side. But thirdly, the new activism calls for a complete rejection of the systemic, symbolic, and intellectual worlds which are inhospitable. Students don't feel at home in our universities. And to tell them that if they don't feel at home, they must pack their bags and go, doesn't help. They do not recognize themselves in what they are forced to learn. And they have to learn disciplinary languages that have no roots in African context, apart from also having to study in a language that's not their own. So saying to students, well, if you don't like it, pack and go. What are you saying? Should 90% of South Africa pack and go where? Finally, this new activism pushes us to understand that we have to free ourselves politically, culturally, economically, and intellectually to raise proper academic, to realize proper academic freedom. And this will link academic freedom with accountability, because that's important. But the elephant in the room is how do different university vice-chancellors deal with this new activism? Some take a high hand, and others choose a more negotiated approach, and yet others hope its energy will evaporate, so they buff up campus security and put their heads in the sand. There's different approaches, right? And although all of these tactics may be problematic, and some of them may be, many believe, actually, that proactive negotiation is the most effective. New activism, however, is deeply suspicious of leadership that overrides the transformational intent of students' protests, similarly to how black consciousness traditions rejected the liberal formulas of the 1970s and 80s. And so, as leadership, it's always a challenge. You always have to understand that the new activism is suspicious of whatever you do. And so thinking about how you do it is important. There is a sense in which such action is seen as supremely colonial, relying on entrenched authority to determine the nature of the transformed university. And this silences the students' voice because in their view, the oppressor still sets the agenda. So how do we work? And that's the challenge. How do we work with students in such a way that they don't feel like the oppressor, whose management, in this case, sets the agenda and they have nothing to say about the way forward? So what do we need to do? Some say we must empathize. And of course, empathy is important, but in my view, it's not sufficient. I think we need a radicalism, even in leadership. The kind of radicalism that can reimagine the university, its role in our society, and has clarity about what the academic project should be about and how we make it happen. We need a radicalism that does not use the American and the British university as a model of what our higher education system should be. And please understand me. When I say we need a radicalism, my view is that radicalism is not anarchy. It is fundamentally about critiquing what was never critiqued. We must stop modifying, reforming, and revising the old and sometimes the West. It is time to be radical in our understanding of what higher education should be about and how. And maybe doing that will actually make us stand out in the world rather than be a substandard Oxford. You know, I always say a good university education should, at the minimum, give you as a student, if you're a student, 3 things. It should give a student knowledge, vision, and courage. And this is why, as much as some of the things about the new activism worry me, this is why the new activism also excites me. Because with all its problems, and complexities and discomforts. Because remember, I'm an executive, I'm in management, so in a sense, I'm the enemy. But there's a good reason it excites me. Because it suggests that we, as the university, have endowed our students with a vision to see the pain that comes with a hard-won democracy. That you don't win a democracy and you just walk through. There's pain that comes with it. And I think at the moment, we experience some of that pain. And some of our students have acquired an internal conviction that things must change for the better. And they're not going to wait for anyone to make things better. They are going to do it themselves. Of course, the challenge is, how do they do it? And how can we channel them to do it? Allow them to do it and do it in productive ways that doesn't just focus on the now, but focus on a future, a strong future for higher education. And so I think it's exciting, and so I remain hopeful. All I can say to the other students standing on the sidelines is that you are among the very few who are privileged. In fact, not only the ones who are standing on the sidelines, all our students. Is that if you are at university today in South Africa, you are among the very few who are privileged. And with privilege and the great knowledge that you have comes great responsibility. So you don't have to be a spectator. So if you're there in a university, don't just stand and look at the mass-fall movements. Get involved in shaping this new activism. Make it what it should be. Make it focus on strengthening our higher education rather than just breaking it down. Making it not just about the now, but about the future. So how you do it might not be maybe about placards. It might be about writing your position and publishing it in a newspaper. Maybe publishing it as a paper online. Maybe starting a blog, or whatever you do. But get involved, because we need academic activism. You will not, if you get involved, you will not only make society, your local community, or the world better, but you will infinitely make yourself better. So don't opt out. Be part of changing the world. You have nothing to lose, but everything to gain. I thank you.